Animal welfare in New Zealand is defined in the Animal Welfare Act as meeting these 5 basic needs of animals. And this is when this Act was passed in 1999, it was world leading in that it was moving from a system of controls to protect the animals from cruelty to one system where we were enhancing the welfare of animals through meeting these needs. The first 3 of these needs are not particularly challenging for most people who are farming or have pets. They focus on those things. It's part of what you do to make sure the animals are healthy and productive. Where most of the challenges come, particularly with farm animals, is looking at what's a desired behaviour, what animal behaviour do they want to express, and how can you cater for that, and how do you avoid distress in farming systems. Although I have to say a lot of the ways we look after companion animals also aren't very satisfactory. And we look at those 5 needs through a number of lenses. Clearly in New Zealand we're unique as a developed country in having such a high dependence on pastoral production systems, and so the economic effects of the regulations we come up with for animal welfare have to be very carefully considered in terms of what harm they may do to our economy. Science is a very important part of it, and with any good public policy, the more we can rely on facts and on science-based evidence, the better. Unfortunately, in animal welfare, this is often the challenge because a lot of the science, as I'll mention shortly, is perhaps not particularly focused on welfare needs. We're increasingly seeing, as we get into more intensive production systems, that we have to consider our animal welfare guidelines and codes and rules in terms of what perverse effects this may have in terms of the environment, and particularly applies to intensive dairying. Reputational considerations are also very important for New Zealand. In fact, the National Animal Welfare Strategy that the Minister has recently released focuses very much on the fact that we must be seen to be a country with high animal welfare standards to support our international trade, and we are often under scrutiny in terms of what are the welfare consequences of the way we're producing our food. And of course ethics is a very important part of animal welfare. The ethical consideration essentially is looking at where do society's values lie. What do we really think is this an acceptable way of treating animals? And this is just to remind us that societal values, ethics, depends very much on where you are. The Chinese very happily eat dogs. This is a dog market. The Norwegians, who have got very high animal welfare standards, also are very proud to eat whale meat, something that we would regard as abhorrent. So different societies, different cultures have different ethical values, and this feeds into the welfare systems. But there are some new lenses that are emerging as well. We're about to amend the Animal Welfare Act in New Zealand, and in the opening statement it will recognise that animals are sentient, and this will be one of the first countries in the world to do this, not the very first. There are 3 or 4 countries now that have in their welfare legislation the recognition that animals are aware of their surroundings, they're aware of what we're doing to them, and this provides additional obligations on us in the ways that we handle and treat them. And I'm sure that this will have quite a significant long-term effect on the way we think about animal welfare in New Zealand. The next thing is more controversial, but is certainly an emerging lens all over the world. And this is the consideration that we need to do more than just thinking about meeting animals' needs. We need to think about what is it that drives, motivates animals, what are the things that they really want to do, providing choice in the way that they behave and on farms, and the way we keep them in cages, a whole raft of stuff. I use the term happiness, and I put it in square brackets because we can't really say whether the animal is happy or not. We try to avoid anthropomorphic considerations, but there are a large number of studies that have been done to show, given choice, animals will prefer to do certain things. So you can take that as an expression of they're more contented doing that than doing some other things. For example, some very good research has just recently been done showing that something that we might regard as common sense, but farmers have been experimenting with is it's very good from a hygiene point of view to provide river stones for bedding for cattle because it's easily clean, a lot less disease. The animals still produce well, they're said to be perfectly happy. But funnily enough, if you give them a choice between sawdust and river stones, there is no contest. They all go in line with sawdust, which of course is a bit difficult for the farmers because it's a lot more expensive and it's harder to keep clean. But that particular study was so overwhelming that we're going to have to rethink how we provide for bedding for cattle. Oh, sorry. Got ahead of myself. Aesthetics is also becoming a sort of a buzzword around the animal welfare space, and I'm sure many of you will recall earlier in the year there was a lot of controversy about calves being clubbed to death, initially in Chile, but it turned out that it was a widespread practice in New Zealand, which of course many of us knew. Now, from an animal welfare point of view, hitting a calf over the head with a mallet is actually quite an effective way of killing them. It causes very little pain and distress. It's instantaneous, but from a societal point of view, it's got what we call a huge yuck factor. It's certainly very offensive and caused a great deal of political fury, and as a result of that, we went through a process of revising the Code of Welfare for dairy animals to prohibit that practice, and that was actually on aesthetics grounds rather than welfare grounds. And that leads into what's now becoming the cutting edge. The Swiss animal welfare legislation has just recently been amended to include a requirement to respect the dignity of animals. And there are three areas in which you can now commit an offence in Switzerland. If you humiliate animals, if you produce animals which have got abnormal characteristics or abnormal features, or if you are teaching them to perform in ways that are abnormal, then you can end up being prosecuted under that dignity code. And I think we're going to start seeing some of that stuff happening here sooner or later. So those are the various lenses that we look through, but in terms of then digesting all of that, we have to consider two things that are set out in the Act. Is what we're doing to the animals unreasonable, or is it unnecessary? And it is an either or, so if something is necessary but is unreasonable, then we shouldn't be doing it. And so let's start with necessary. Necessary should be an objective test. It should substantially be based on good agricultural practice and science, and it should provide us a way of analysing whether something really has to be done. It should be unavoidable, and it should provide some broader benefits. And if it's not necessary, of course, then it must be unreasonable. But whether something is reasonable or not is much more subjective, and I use this quote because it actually encapsulates a lot of the stuff that we do in working with animal welfare. We have to really consider whether what we're doing to the animals is outweighed by greater interests, societal interests, or the interests of animals. And there are very few occasions on which what we do to animals is reasonable in terms of their needs. It's really what we're doing is applying a societal test each time. Is it to society's benefit to treat animals in this way? Now, in making those sorts of considerations, we have some issues. There is often what's termed an ethical vacuum, where for various reasons the proponents of a particular animal welfare or a particular way of using animals don't want to talk about it. They recognise there are some welfare consequences, but they'd rather sort of duck the issue. And instead of coming out on the front foot and saying, well, there are some problems here, but this is the way we're dealing with it, they go quiet. And that allows the activists to get involved. And we've got currently quite a strong campaign around New Zealand, orchestrated by an organisation called SAFE, to get the political parties out to ban factory farming. Factory farming is a buzzword for a lot of stuff, and we're not quite sure what the Labor Party means when it says it's going to ban factory farming by 2017, but it'll be an interesting challenge for them. Agribusiness, as I say, tends to be defensive about this stuff rather than coming out and engaging with the activists and the protesters. Their natural inclination is to go quiet. In America, they resort to what are known as the ag-gag laws, so they do everything they can to keep people away from their intensive farming operations, so society doesn't understand what's happening behind the fence. Like in a lot of areas, 1080 debate would be a good example. You can have very strong science, but the debate usually is raging around outside of the science. So that it's all very well to say the facts are these. A lot of people have their own set of facts, of course, which they make up. And the other problem we have with the science is that it's often inadequate in this area because a lot of the animal welfare, animal production science has been about how to get more out of your animals rather than how to make them happier. And we all want cheap food. I was having a discussion with one of your members earlier that most people profess going to the supermarket and they want to buy free-range eggs and pork, but when you look at their supermarket trolleys when they come out, they discover it was just a little bit pricey, so they slip the old battery eggs back in the cart anyway. On a bigger level, this is one of the perverse consequences. If we go through a situation of banning factory farming in New Zealand, what we will do is replace reasonably high welfare pork produced in New Zealand with low welfare pork imported from overseas countries using intensive farming systems. Same thing happened in Europe. The Swiss banned battery eggs and imported them all from Germany. Just a range of organisations, these various animal rights groups, and by animal rights we go from the spectrum of animal welfare, where people are like the SPCA, an animal welfare NGO. They recognise that we use animals in various ways. They want to see it done properly. The animal rights groups believe there is no justification for using animals in any shape or form. And so they can be quite motivating in the way that they get about raising their supporters. And currently SAFE is being pretty effective. Don't worry about reading all that stuff, but basically the message there is farming in New Zealand is a totally different activity now than it was 25, 30 years ago. We've really intensified already. We've got very large dairy herds. Our poultry and egg production is incredibly concentrated, and really just about all the eggs you buy in New Zealand are controlled by 3 companies. The chicken meat, which is by far our biggest protein, is controlled by 2 companies. So this concentration has led to a lot of concentration in production. This is what it looks like. I think some of you might have seen the Campbell Live program a few weeks ago. I thought they did very well in presenting the facts around intensive egg production. These cages have been banned in a number of countries. They are now banned in New Zealand. They're being phased out by 2022. They'll be gone. That will be about a $70 million cost for the industry to transition from the current system to new systems, because the price of eggs will go up by about 15 or 20% as well. Although if SAFE have their way and ban colony cages, then the price of eggs will probably double. This is an American sow farming operation. These animals spend their lives in cages like that. When they're pregnant, they're in slightly bigger cages, but they still can't turn round. When they're not pregnant, they're sitting in these stalls waiting to be mated and developing their fetuses. This is just a small shed in a small farm in America. They farm on a massive industrial scale. These crates will be banned in New Zealand from the end of this year, and they're virtually eliminated now. That's the sort of intensification that we see with chicken meat production. And that's not a New Zealand shed, but the sheds here are very similar. I don't think many of you will realise that the chicken that we eat is about 5.5 weeks old. We have bred these birds to grow so fast that they achieve that size in 5.5 weeks. You compare that with a 5.5-week-old chicken that's been reared to lay eggs, and they're about that big. It's just the physiological stress that these animals are under is just huge. There are good things about intensification as well, though, and I've already covered that in terms of some of the lenses we look through. You can get better disease control, you can get better environmental protection, better food safety, and these issues can't be just lightly ignored in terms of the whole animal welfare equation. This is an example of an intensive dairy operation. It's actually in Holland, this particular herd, but lots of New Zealand farms like this. Very nice, clean, excellent shed. The interesting thing about this is that I got the photo off an animal rights blog site where they regard this as disgusting. In New Zealand, we're now starting to move towards fully housed dairy operations. There are about 15 or 20 large farms in New Zealand where the cows spend virtually their whole lives indoors. And this particular farm I visited, and I have to say I've seen the happiest, most contented cows that you could ever come across. These animals were able to get up and milk themselves when they felt like it, robotic milking machines. They wandered over and fed themselves ad lib whenever they wanted to. There was a robot going up and down the aisle pushing their feed back towards the feeding area. The floor was getting scraped every 20 minutes to remove all the faeces and so on, and so they had a clean environment. And to cap it off, there was something like the big brush in a car wash where they could get over and get a back scratch, and there was usually 8 or 9 cows standing in a queue waiting for their turn to back scratch. I know a fair bit about animals, and I can tell you from the demeanour of those animals, they were very happy, content, some of the best welfare I've ever seen, and yet there is a lot of opposition towards intensification of dairying. For example, Whisper, capitalising on the fact that most people don't realise that the milk that comes in a bottle actually came from a cow, present a campaign of trying to get away from intensive dairying. Down on the farm, it's not all great either. This is a New Zealand farm down near Waimate. This is called a sacrifice paddock. For those of you who don't know about sacrifice paddocks, it's pretty standard in New Zealand that you put your pregnant cows after they're dried off out into a paddock in the winter time when it's wet, and they mulch up that particular bit of ground because you're protecting all the rest of your pasture for the spring growth. And so they get fed there, they get plenty of food, they're not losing condition. Unfortunately, some of them calve in those conditions, which is pretty bad for the calves. The interesting thing about this photo, it's from another blog. It's a young Welshman who was farming here in New Zealand, and that's the sort of image that is such a risk to our international reputation. It also, unfortunately, only tells half the story, because that's the same farm just a few months later. So there you have what most people would regard as a high welfare situation. So there are no black and white answers about all this stuff. It's a very interesting area, and as I say, I found it one of the most fascinating places to be working in terms of such a broad range of issues. And thank you very much for your attention. We're right in that space, Russ. In fact, the amended Act will require NAWAC to consider the welfare of wild animals, which currently it doesn't. We will be setting some guidelines for acceptable hunting practice, for example, working with the various hunting groups. And as far as pest control is concerned, there is a lot of work going on now to develop more humane slaughter methods of pests. So trap design, land care have done a lot of work on improving trap design to cut down the amount of suffering that traps can cause. And increasingly, the work that's done in toxin research is to try and find toxins that are basically more humane, that don't cause a great deal of pain and suffering for the animals as they die. So, yeah, pest control is certainly there, and we're actually talking to the National Pest Control Group virtually as I speak, in terms of coming up with some national guidelines on possum and rat control.